destruction verified.
Hello, my Verdict Warriors. Today we're going to be talking about pulse guns and you, a short study in pulse guns. So before we get into things, I'll at least give you a quick rundown of what we're going to get into today. We're going to cover each of the main pulse guns, at least as I see them, being the Neodori Model 1, the Nappa, the Mahan, and with some bonus content being the Knuckle, the Bluette, and the second box pulse, which actually doesn't have a name. Well, the first one we'll talk about is the Neodori Model 1. It is the most basic pulse gun available. In a single sentence, this is your starter pulse gun, and in all regards, this thing is darn easy to use within its effective range. Most ACs can sustain firing it for several shots before they run out of energy. It is functionally a thermal energy shotgun, firing a spread of 6 shots when you pull the trigger. The Neodori can be considered an accurate pulse gun, for a pulse gun. Although, like all thermal weapons, it has dramatic damage fall-off, with the projectiles violently dissipating when they reach their maximum range. The Neodori Model 1 is the easiest pulse gun to use, with strong handling characteristics between its good muzzle velocity, lock time, reload speed, and energy drain. Equipping 2 of these can allow you to attack enemies decisively, or even defend yourself up close, provided your FCS and turning speed are enough to track your target. The main limitation with the Neodori Model 1 is that its damage is relatively low. 1065 TE is not hard to resist, and almost any AC interested in packing on a little bit of that extra thermal bulk can hit this number. It is easily the most visible threat to ACs that don't sport that natural thermal bulk, so if you can't resist a Neodori pulse gun, you're going to want a TE shield. 2 of these, for example, can do upwards of 10k in one attack, if all the projectiles hit. And follow-up attacks are pretty easy to land, so you remain vulnerable even if the first pass doesn't kill you. Now, if you're running shot pulse with this, you can hit fast that 1065 number, and threaten ACs with up to 1330 TE defense. This means that you can safely shot pulse most mids. That makes the pairing of a shotgun and a Neodori Model 1 a very consistent weapon combination. Just remember that your shotgun has to hit slightly before the pulse gun can, so it armor breaks the target, causes stagger. You won't armor break a quad with a shotgun, but it can help you deal with our TE shield, for example, and let you slip those juicy extra pulse gun hits in. Now, this is a touchy subject, but when speaking on the subject of pulse guns, we often overlook the topic of energy amplifiers. Shoulder units in Verdict Day are, well, pretty much the most important part of your AC, and if you're not running a damaging option or a subcomputer, you're kinda out of luck. You really feel like you're at a disadvantage. And amps are weird. So, let's look at this example. You can amp your Neodori Model 1, and you have 2 different energy amps available. Now, amps function by amplifying your damage. They multiply it by the listed values, whether that's damage, range, and also the per-shot drain, remember. Now, the amps don't affect anything like impact, muzzle velocity, that is bullet speed, or the explosion range. So when range is considered, it actually is increasing your weapon's lock range, and the distance that it fires, which is kind of funny. The power amp, meanwhile, is what's going to increase your damage dealt by about 20%. The range amp, in scare quotes I'm going to put it here, is not as effective at increasing your range as you might think. So while it purportedly improves both the damage and the range by a lesser amount, the range increase is deceptive in its usefulness to you. Remember, we're using pulse guns. It's only increasing the range, not the muzzle, not the accuracy. So when you use it on pulse guns, which by the way are shotguns basically, that are primarily employed within kissing distance of the enemy, the improvement in range is not really worth your consideration. That's my thought anyways. Furthermore, amps are extremely heavy. They're like 900 weight, I think, and amping pulse guns is a major commitment. since they take a shoulder unit that could be used for subs or missiles. Now, amping anything in general is not very commonly done, and that's especially the case with pulse guns, since pulse guns are generally not your primary attacking option. But if you do want to amp your Neodories, and you do want your pulse guns to be, the dedicated primary weapon on your AC, then they will hit that much harder with the amp. But they're also going to drain more, which is a double-edged sword, of course. See, pulse guns could be the best candidates for amp use, since their main limitation is that they don't often penetrate targets. That is, having the additional damage means you'll have an easier time penetrating the target's defenses. And, of course, then when you do find an AC that's weak to your pulse guns, you will do even more damage than normal. The only thing you need to remember about energy amps and pulse guns is that you generally only use them to increase the pulse gun's ability to hit other enemy targets, hit above certain defense thresholds, rather than actually rendering the weapon more powerful in general. Like, you only want to hit effectively. You don't actually really care about the extra percentage damage that you're going to get. You typically don't get much more total burst damage out of the pulse gun itself, even though you would think it'd be a big dividend considering they fire multiple shots and they have pretty decent damage. It's just that the numbers are so low that the percentage-based amp is not as impactful as something like, flat damage increase. If you really want to see high thermal damage numbers from amps, you want to look towards sawas like the 12-shot or the 4-shot. That said, here are some tables comparing the basic performance of the Neodori Model 1 with their amp performance. This should give you a clue as to whether or not you want to bother amping them. Please be mindful that dual amp setups are multiplicative, so the damage and drain effects are applied twice. Same thing with the range. So you might think that 150% range on your pulse gun is kind of cool, but again, it's a shotgun. It's got spread on it. You may be cutting out a paper outline of your enemy AC rather than actually hitting them with the pulses, which can be really annoying. We can see this effect happening with pulse cannons, which allegedly have range, but those pellets have such spread that they'll miss often. Now, combining a shot pulse strategy with an amp or two will only rarely allow you to effectively target ACs which have innately high TE defense. The general rule is to never bother with pulse guns if you see significant TE defenses. Also, you need to keep in mind that against quads, they usually have enough innate recoil resistance to not be armor broken by your shotgun. This means that even light-legged TE stacked quads are going to resist shot pulse in terms of just the armor break potential of it, meaning that your pulse gun, if they have the TE defense, is not going to hit over it. And that's generally with or without the addition of an energy amplifier. You could, hypothetically, use something like a Sawa, which has very high impact force, to help you armor break for a pulse gun, but at that point, we're getting into Lululand, dude. I don't know what to tell you. You're expending so much energy to target something like that, for the most part, it probably couldn't give less of a shit that you're pulsing them, let's be real. This would also possibly skew our cost-benefit analysis in favor of you using pretty much any other goddamn weapon on your AC if you had the choice to do so. Anyways, if your only weapons are pulse guns, and you have to shoot something heavy, or something with, high thermal defenses or a TE shield, you're almost better off alt-tabbing back to World of Warcraft or Love and Deep Space or whatever. I don't know what y'all playing these days. You do you, my dude. That's enough about the Neodori Model 1. We have more Neodori to share with you. The next common pulse gun can be viewed as a direct upgrade, in my opinion, to the Neodori Model 1. It is the Neodori Model 3, a weapon with greater firepower but less accuracy and, of course, greater firing drain. The Neodori Model 3, also called the Nappa in Armored Core 5, is a fine choice for a shot pulse setup, but some ACs may struggle to fire multiple shots in succession since the drain on the Neodori Model 3 is a lot higher than that of the Neodori Model 1. Here you are for a comparison. Now, the Nappa hits for 1149 TE, which is a little bit harder to resist. It also fires 6 projectiles like the Neodori Model 1, and so does damage comparable to, but still commensurately more than the Neodori Model 1, with very little reduction in rate of fire, lock speed, or muzzle velocity. This means that it has a very high burst and good DPS potential. but you must make your shots count because it drains a considerable amount. Now, running 2 Napas at once will be extremely devastating against low TE targets. With a shot pulse setup, for example, your Napa will also chunk targets all the way up to 1436 TE, provided the shotgun actually armor breaks. That means you can typically shot pulse any TE core mid that isn't running a second TE part, like a TE arm or TE head. Again, that doesn't mean that you're doing any more damage, you're just hitting 1436 defense. And that threshold means that you're reducing their armor by 20% when you armor break, meaning that your little 1149 damage that would be ineffective is now effective, which means that your target would need to have more than 1436 defense in order to resist the defense reduction effect from the armor break. I hope that makes sense. Basically, they would need that 1436 defense number in order to resist 1149 damage after their defenses are reduced by armor break by 20%. Is that clear? Moving on. If you choose to amp your Napa, this is what it would look like. The important thing to remember here is that your single power amped Napa hits for 1390 TE, which is above Mahoan resistance numbers. We'll get there in a second. And that indicates that single amp Napas will basically chew up almost any medium biped in the game, without needing armor break support. Now, if you still are using armor break support, your shot pulse setup with that amp is going to hit up to 1737 TE defense. That means you would need 1737 in order to resist that Napa after armor break. Basically, anything that has this much TE is probably a TE stack quad, or some crazy 3-part TE stack midweight biped. Amping a Napa twice is doable, but you pay such a steep price for cost in firing the weapon that it may not ever be worth trying. Think about it, it's like 180% times 2, that's what, oh fuck, that's a lot of drain, dude. Look at that number. Another issue with the dual amp setup is that in swapping from single shoulder to dual shoulder arms, you need to keep in mind that the firing stability of your arms will influence how accurate your pulse gun spread is. The Napa already struggles with some inaccuracies even at close ranges, and that can affect your damage output since missed pellets means missed damage opportunities. Swapping to dual shoulder arms to fit a second amp on may mean that your shots will miss due to the increased spread that you can only compensate for by basically humping your target while firing.
So the weird thing is that the Neodori Model 1 and the Napa are pretty similar. They have relatively equivalent sheet DPS and true DPS and burst, with the Napa only beating out the Neodori with 400 points of burst. However, its accuracy isn't quite as good, and it drains a lot more. So, although the Napa doesn't have more DPS, I feel like it still has that solid burst potential, particularly if you're using it in a shot pulse setup, because it can hit much higher TE targets. If you're, for example, focusing on killing KE quads, their performance is roughly equivalent. They take about the same amount of energy to actually kill a KE quad in terms of just shooting it until it dies. The Neodori Model 1 will do it in 5 attacks. Rather, if you have 2 of them and shoot 10 total pulse gun attacks at it, it'll go down. Whereas the Napa actually gets the 4-shot kill in terms of firing 8 total attacks if you have 2 Napas out, but it costs roughly the same energy. So I think the question is mostly what are you trying to hit with this pulse weapon? Because if it's stuff that doesn't have TE defense, maybe the Neodori is better because you can use those follow-up attacks and get more bursts in, more shots in when you make your pass, and then back out with that extra energy you save. Or if you really need to make that shot count and you can't afford to have a weapon that's ineffective, I think the Napa is going to be your main guy there, especially if you're using shot pulse. Because if a enemy midweight tries to buff out Mahan, for example, you're still going to hit over that with a Napa shot pulse setup. Whereas with the Neodori Model 1, you won't after shot pulse. They hit really similar targets, but I think it's going to be down to your personal preference as to which one you're going to pick. I know looking at these numbers has actually caused me to reconsider my use of the Neodori Model 1. I think a fun setup might be to have one of each, and then just use your shotgun to Napa shot pulse. And then if you have a target that's weak to both pulse guns, you just whip out the Napa and the Neodori, and you just go to town on that. And that should at least save you some energy when you're getting those big pulse, those big dull pulse shots in. It's still going to be 10, 11k damage output. Food for thought.
Now, the other main pulse gun that you'll see in the wild, and perhaps the last and certainly most powerful of the Trinity or Big 3 common pulse gun choices, is the Mahan, or Mahoan. I don't know how the fuck you're going to say that. The R31? Whatever. The Mahone hits hard, firing shots at 1376 TE damage, and with respectable range. The Mahone does, however, not fire 6 rounds per trigger pull, but 4. This actually reduces your total damage output, being less than either the Nidori Model 1 or the Nidori Model 3. And that could be very significant if you're trying to trade aggressively and aren't just defending yourself. So the Mahone is a strange gun when you really think about it, right? It has high drain, but good range and power. And the power is effective because it really helps your weapon hit effective. And that means you're going to get more damage out of the gun. But with less total damage per trigger pull, that's not quite as effective, especially on a weapon that wants to be in kissing distance to really get all those shots to hit. Especially because the further away your target is, the less damage the gun will do because fewer rounds are going to hit. So even though this used to boast good accuracy, several nerfs over the lifespan of the game cause the gun to spread around your target when firing at further ranges. So despite the apparently strong range on this model, you'll still need to get pretty damn close to actually land any of the pellets. So despite being a weapon that has high damage and good range, in truth it doesn't really have either. Still, with the greater attack power, it'll hit more targets for effective damage, and that matters. You'll hit most mids pretty effectively unless they're running specialized frames. And that's really the main appeal of this weapon. You typically don't care what you're shooting at, if it's a light, if it's a mid, if it's a quad. If it's weak to TE, it's going to get hit by this. And even if they try to prepare by having Napa defenses on their build, like even if they're a little bit TE stacked, you're still going to hit them with the Mahone. So the consistency is where it's at. And it has pretty good range. The issue there is just the drain. It's kind of hard to use. It's my personal opinion. Still, with the greater attack power and the greater ability to hit for effective damage, this might also be the main reason you want to amp your pulse guns, is to use an amp Mahone. We'll get there in a minute. So shot pulse with a Mahone hits to 1720, which very few mids will be able to comfortably attain this TE defense. That total damage, though, is not as impressive as you think, and the drain is also strenuous. It's less damage than the other two pulses, each shot, and that's also more damage lost if a round doesn't connect. Still, the Mahone boasts the best range in the category even after the nerfs, which means that it can be much more consistent than other pulse guns, particularly when fighting in high latency. If you need those shots to reach out and touch somebody, they will. This used to be my favorite pulse gun, particularly in Armored Core 5 when it was, actually accurate, didn't have all these nerfs, but I've since moved on to what I believe are greener pastures. I'll fill you in a minute. Now, the raw power of the Mahone, as mentioned already, does lend it extra penetrative capacity, and it benefits very much from amplifiers. Consult this table for more information. Keep in mind that the high innate firing drain of the Mahone is exasperated by using amps. But, again, amplifying the Mahone makes it effective against just about any target that doesn't have great TE defense. You may find it to be a consistent and enjoyable setup if playing pulses is your favorite style on Verdict Day. For example, you can put this on a heavyweight, and suddenly you are an amped pulse brawler, which doesn't really care what it's shooting at unless it's another heavyweight, which you could bring bays for. Right then, so I've covered the big 3 pulse guns, but there are 3 more that you might want to consider, even though they're not as common. Now, I won't lie to you here. I'm not going to be able to restrict my biases concerning these 3. So if unparalleled destructive force is your goal, you'll want to consider the hidden 4th member of the pulse gun pantheon, the dark horse of the family, the Knuckle. The Knuckle hits for 1170 TE, which is slightly higher than the Napa, and it also fires 8 shots rather than 6. This makes it devastating when hitting effectively, but you do pay for that firepower. It drains like a monster, and in addition it has poor accuracy and poor muzzle velocity. You practically have to be within kissing distance to land shots with this gun. Oh, and since it fires 8 shots at a time, you will actually run out of ammunition pretty quickly, so be careful with that. Now I will say, as a defensive weapon for fighting off lightweights, as a means of also taking down evasive mids in a pinch with the shot pulse setup, or just crashing through tetrapods on the attack with raw offensive power, the knuckle offers unparalleled instantaneous firepower, even though you may never be able to sustain using it for very long. For an example, shot pulse with the knuckle hits for 1462, which is higher than most TE mids will bother to reach, particularly because it is higher than the defense threshold, for example, of the Jupiter plasma missile, which is 1452, I think. So the things you probably target with this really won't be particularly viable targets if you have other effective weapons available, given the energy expenses involved in actually firing the damn thing. As a hard and fast rule, you'd have a better time firing on targets that are weak to the knuckle alone, rather than using shot pulse with it. Firing two at once, though, boasts such a prohibitive cost that it's almost worth just using the one. Still, if you can use two of them at once, the damage output is ludicrous. It's almost as much as two Kurosawas, and you can fire these fuckers all the time. It's not just 4 shots. It's a big commitment, and you need to basically kiss your target with the makeout session in order to get the damage, but you will blow your target away in just a few pulls of the trigger. Now, amping knuckles drives their energy cost even higher. But if you wanted to do that, this is what it would look like. The energy cost, of course, goes through the roof, but you'll probably basically 3-tap your target. I've tried this before with just a single amp and a single shot pulse setup with a knuckle. And, yeah, this is some good stuff, my guy. Consider also that because of how close to your target you need to be in order to hit with the knuckle, you may as well just try using an actual laser blade if you're considering investing in an energy amplifier. That's 900 weight from the amp, you may as well just bring a blade, dude. That way you won't be totally sunk against things like heavies or tanks, since a boosted Moonlight hit may still hit for like 15k.
Hey, maybe you thought I was bullshitting you about that, but no, seriously. Compare it with the Moonlight or the Sawa. It's pretty similar. Consult this chart. Admittedly, if you're using a Moonlight, the drain is a lot less for pretty comparable damage, but it'll probably be a little bit harder to hit with. But seriously, consider Moonlight if you're really looking at the knuckle. And similarly, you can compare the Sawa with a knuckle as well. They really do roughly the same amount of damage. Now, I wouldn't really amp either of those, but if you wanted a Moonlight and an amp, you could do that. Likewise, if you wanted to amp the knuckle, just think about a Moonlight instead. If you're amping Sawas, you're crazy, dude. That drain is just out of this fucking world. Like, you can't even afford that. I think you could barely afford to charge one on a Sohn. So, yeah, there you have it.
Now, since I finished with the major contenders in the pulse gun category, I'll only give you a cursory look at these last two. These are honorable mentions, mostly suitable for specialists who are seeking a new take on the pulse gun formula, and both of these are rather uncompromising in their commitment to being, I guess you'd call, ultra-low drain pulse guns. They have particularly limited firepower and range. They are specialized weapons, and generally not something you want to build around, considering the Nidori Model 1 is right there and features an excellent mix of handling and firepower traits. These two are colloquially called the box pulses. The first one had the ACV name of Bluette, and the second generation one, I don't remember what its name was. We'll just call it Bluette Model 2 or Box Pulse Model 2. We'll start with the Bluette. The Bluette is an even more energy efficient version of the Nidori Model 1, but it only fires 4 shots per trigger pull as opposed to 6. And since it also does less damage, this means it hits a lot less hard. The other key limiting factor is its range. The range is pretty poor, and you've got to be really close to the target to hit your shots. Now, this energy efficiency aspect of the Bluette is its saving grace, which allows it to fire continuously with the best rate of fire in the category. This is a weapon that can potentially melt an opponent if you catch them unaware, since the rate of fire and sustainability of that rate of fire are unparalleled in the category. It handles a little bit like a mix of a pulse machine gun and a plasma gun. It fires quickly, does good damage, but you need to be close. Although one other drawback here is that since it is just a pulse gun, it has pretty limited penetrating power, making it only suitable for a shot pulse setup to target light ACs or KE-focused quads and HRJs that have bare-bones TE defense. You could tear them up pretty quick. Now, here's something funny. You could amp the Bluette, but at that point, you just have a weapon that's so statistically similar to something like a knuckle that you may as well just use the knuckle itself. The main thing to remember with this weapon is that it cannot keep up in a bursty, hit-and-fade style. That said, the most important factor in your ability to get the most out of this weapon will consist in how long you can maintain a firing position in your target's blind spot. If you can flank a quad and stay out of its FCS, you can bring it down pretty quickly with a Bluette with sustained fire. Now, its bigger brother, Box Pulse number 2 over here, has more damage output and better range, which, if you found the Bluette lacking those two, you may prefer this one. Still, those benefits come with some costs. The increased energy consumption and longer reload time mean that this weapon may not actually be much better than its little brother, the Bluette. Keep that in mind when you use this weapon. Determine whether you want greater versatility or more specialized performance, and make that decision for yourself. In closing, I decided not to cover individual tunes for pulse guns, and I just assumed full power for the sake of making easy calculations. Most every weapon in the game is tuned for full power at all times, but in some circumstances, such as here with the pulse guns, you might actually want to take a few points in accuracy in order to boost the hit rate a little bit more. Taking points in accuracy when you're tuning also has the added effects of reducing your reload rate, increasing your muzzle velocity, accuracy, as well as reducing total drain. These factors could be important if you're trying to consider which pulse gun to use. Generally speaking, losing out on power with such low penetration weapons is not advisable, but some targets have defenses that are overmatched so thoroughly by pulse guns that the loss in power for a better hit rate might be worthwhile to you. Still, you want to think carefully about each situation when you take away a little power on your pulses. Let's look at the Mahone for example. The main selling point of the weapon is the high damage, meaning it penetrates most targets. Now when you reduce the firepower of the Mahone, we still hit for 1238. But that now misses out on hitting many midweight bipeds effectively without armor break support. However, you will see higher muzzle velocity, better rate of fire, slightly better accuracy, and less drain if you invest 1 point of tuning into accuracy, rather than full power. If you want a very reliable shot pulse setup, maybe that's what you would want, but it likely won't help you kill your targets any quicker, just make those shots a little bit more consistent. But since drain is a limiting factor on weapons like this, perhaps that's something that's going to matter to you. I have absolutely seen accuracy tunes on pulses when I was playing on JP, so I won't bullshit you, they're viable. I have even used full accuracy tuned knuckles before, but at that point, I really may have well just used a Neodori Model 1. This is the sort of issue with pulse guns in a nutshell. If you try and specialize any given gun for something that it isn't built for, you end up with a weapon that's so statistically similar to, but still worse, compared to another pulse gun in the category. For example, that full accuracy knuckle is only going to do 500 more burst damage than a full power Neodori Model 1, and with less penetrative capacity and less range. In closing, if I didn't mention a pulse gun in this rundown, it's because it's awful. I jest, but many weapons in this game are just strictly weaker than their peers. There are many reasons for this, although the particulars of each case are not really worth asking about. If I were to improve some of these pulse guns, maybe the Neodori Model 2, I'd have fire 4 pellets, but fire in a burst of 2 per trigger pull, like a 3BR, where it just goes zoot zoot. That might help it have a little bit more burst firepower, because compared to the Neodori Model 1, it's less damage, has a good fire rate, but fuck dude, it's just worse. Anyways, let me know if you learned something useful, and if you didn't, tell me to go fuck myself, I don't know. See ya.
Pas parasugan. Parasugan. Reza supi.
That fucking microphone.